everyone, welcome to a new episode of Carolyn Talks, and this is one of my special episodes for the 2022 Toronto International Film Festival, otherwise known as TIFF. I am your host, Carolyn Hines, and this is the podcast YouTube channel where I speak to film creators about their work, the industry, and what inspires them. And today I am joined by composer Kalaisan Kalaichelvan. Yes, I got it right. Yeah. To talk about his work on the film This Place. So this film was made in Toronto and is made by an entirely a Canadian creative team. And Kalaisan is a Toronto native. He's from Scarborough, wherever. And yeah, and This Place is it was a very profound film, and it resonated a lot with me because being an immigrant, there's a lot of themes about immigration, about displacement, about finding your identity as an immigrant. And even though it's a queer love story, it's interesting how all of that ties into this love story between these two women, but they can't begin their love story until they start to discuss who they are as immigrants and who they are as First Nations, because one of the characters is Mohawk. And I'm so happy to be talking to Kalaisan today because this film is interesting because it talks about Tamil identity, Mohawk, Canadian Indigenous First Nations, as well as Iranian, and all of these different music styles are integrated into the score of this film. But before we do that, as usual, I like to ask my guests to say a bit about themselves and what got them into their career path. So for you, Kalaisan, what got you involved into becoming a musician and a film composer?
Yeah, I mean, growing up, I was kind of a very typical over-programmed brown kid, basically. My parents sent me to a lot of music lessons. I grew up with classical Western piano training, but also South Asian Carnatic music training. I was a percussionist, I was a flautist. I was just sent to a lot of things. And at the same time, it was like, med school is the goal. So it was that kind of weird thing. And I was just the kid that was, I was really in love with classical music. I was also really in love with film music. Like I grew up listening to like Thomas Newman and Howard Shore and John Williams. And in high school, I was just always in the band hall and everything. And my music teachers noticed that about me, and they would always ask me to write little things for other ensembles. So it was kind of just always happening. In terms of my education, like I'm classically trained with the RCM and my ARCT and stuff, but I ended up going to school for biochem. And yeah, it's this funny trajectory. And I ended up working in cancer research for years. But I was always working with my school orchestra. I had a lot of different colleagues in art circles and friends in theater, dance and film who knew I was kind of obsessed with this music thing, and they'd ask me to do things for them. And that kind of just started snowballing. And eventually I just realized this is what I have to do with music. Now I'm like fully into music, and I've been writing for films for some time now. And I also write concert or contemporary classical music as well for just different ensembles. So it's been a very weird circular path here, but we're here and it's exciting.
That's amazing. I'm kind of the same way. Like I'm in film criticism. I'm a film critic and a journalist, but that was not the path that I started on. But it's like life is that way. And I think I guess it kind of to be using a musical analogy, it's kind of like a music score. Like you start on one line, and then you like the score never flows exactly. It's all up and down. But before we go on, I do have to ask, because who is it's kind of hard to ask who your favorite composer is, but like, what is your favorite genre of classical music? Like mine is Baroque. So I love Baroque style classical music, and I love like Beethoven, Mozart, of course, but like Chevalier and, and all these guys, and Rachmaninoff and things. So which is like your favorite genre or your favorite classical composer?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I guess for so much of my life, I was just really in love with the Impressionists. So Debussy and Ravel and Poulenc and all the French folks in the early days was huge for me. But then, also Stravinsky is massive for me. And then even the later modernist stuff like Berio and Xenakis and the weirder things that happened later in the 21st century. And also a huge fan of John Adams and some of the post-minimalists. So like, this is the thing about my life is that, my brain I've been told by a friend, it's a very Gemini thing of me to be like, but my brain is tickled by all these just different ways of thinking about sound and
Yeah.
style, and how like in 100 years how much music changed from 1900 to 2000 and all the crazy things it was doing. And I'm still digesting all of it, and I think
Mm.
in some way even my music changes in that sense too.
And that is like the perfect segue to my first question. So like at the beginning, I mentioned how this place, it talks about different cultures and immigration stuff. And but like because it's talking about multiple cultures and multiple identities, the film features multiple music styles. You know, you have traditional Iranian music, especially at the beginning, because it begins with these Iranian characters and they're immigrating to Canada, but actually they're refugees, so they're fleeing from the conflict in Iran at that time, and that was around late 1980s, early 1990s, and there's this. Sorry, get down. My dog is excited; she wants to become involved in the conversation.
Oh, she's got to come make an appearance. Come on. No.
Yoko, if I call her, she'll jump up. But that's like she'll be completely still as soon as I start talking on the phone. She on the laptop. She wants to be involved. No,
I love it. She loves the camera. It's great.
no, she doesn't actually. She doesn't even like me.
Oh.
She refuses to look at the camera whenever I try to take pictures. She turns her back on me. But but I digress.
Yeah.
So I want to begin like there, like beginning with the how the music you integrate like Iranian traditional music into the score from the beginning, because it has this very particular feel, because the film begins with them fleeing and it's about angst and terror and uncertainty. So how do you as a composer go about researching like the different instruments and the songs that you want to involve to start the film? Because like the music begins and it sets the tone of the film, like, you know, so you have to start on a good tone. So like, how do you go about just composing the first sound that we, the audience, is going to hear?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, it was a really important conversation for us. Like, when we started, we were like, there are all these complex characters that come from these different communities. And what is our responsibility with the music to address that? And I think where we landed, it became important for us that, we decided to move away from trying to bring in like all these different kinds of cultural and traditional instruments from these communities, because the film does so much already about like these characters speaking about their experiences and stuff. We realize, what's the role of the music in this? So is the music going to already just imitate what's happening on screen, or are we trying to bring a different perspective to the film? And what music can do, and it's so powerful in this way in a film, is that it automatically sets up a way to view a film, right?
Yeah.
So we knew that, what the music had to do was had to come from a place of feeling, from emotion. The characters are there's already these beautiful scenes where we hear Malay and Goaniosha talk about their different experiences as refugees, as indigenous people, as people of two cultures and traditions. And it felt wrong that the music had to now suddenly, should we bring in some indigenous instruments here? Should we bring in some Tamil instruments here? It felt kind of too tokenistic. It felt like we were going to suddenly put the movie in a box, and that, only their identity is everything. So what the music had to do was, how do we bring the characters out? Like, we're seeing the world of Toronto, the city that inhabits all these different complex and multifaceted characters and communities, through the eyes of these two young women, right? These two young women who are discovering love for the first time, these two young women who are reckoning with their mixed feelings about their fathers and their family. And that's what the music had to really bring out. So we were very deliberate about instrumentation and color and music. But I was keen on not you drawing from, like, I didn't want a sitar or like a mridangam for a Tamil context. I didn't want to trap into indigenous drumming and in a very obvious way. But there are moments where we pay tribute to that. In the end, in a scene where we had this sort of Goniyoshta speaking to her father through this Iranian poetry, but also seeing shots of her mother burying, doing this whole ritual. I got my friend who's from the Comanche Nation to play this fiddle solo. That was also something that was a very subtle way of tying in this cultural thread. But, it became to, like, you spoke about that feeling of that angst in the beginning, right? So like for that, this whole character of Goniosha's Iranian father, we kind of used this sort of mandolin texture, mandolin musical theme that would be what drives that angst. In the same way, we have these oboe solos that sort of covers Gonyosha's theme about her innocence and how she finds her courage and how she sees Toronto, because this is her first time in a big city and everything seems so big and wondrous. And you see this beautiful mural, you see all the way that Queen Street is sort of popping out. And it was that perspective that we needed the music to have, right? We brought in my friend Alexander Pekovsky's voice to bring the love theme for the two of them. When we hear about like Male's father, think about Sri Lanka and Jaffna or Yalpanam, and about this idea of home, I wrote these sort of brass quartet pieces. So, because so much of it, I think for me was, the goal the music had to really do is create this sort of freeze time for a second, because both these people have entered almost this dream state where they're like, in love with each other and in love with the place that they're in and dealing with their feelings of love for their family. And that's what the music is trying to tell. I think we wanted to avoid by becoming these cultural tropes and cliches, because the film was already doing so much about speaking about community and culture. So it's this whole deal of like, do we want to put a hat on a hat? And what is the music trying to do? Like, it's trying to come from a place of feeling. And that was the first directive for me writing the score.
And the thing and as you just mentioned, that it's about them falling in love. And with this film, like, you have to balance very carefully in between the romantic music, the music where they're looking at each other, like their first time they meet, like there's instant chemistry, like the music is just like, it's very lightly, and it's not like overly sentimental. It's not like about, like, there's sometimes you can tell with a film where the score is being done to make the audience feel something that they wouldn't necessarily feel without the score, and sometimes it feels forced. You're just like, I want you to cry, so I'm gonna play this overly sentimental music so you can feel your emotions. And then there's Sundays where the score is just easy and it feels natural, and it feels like the soundtrack of their life. So that's what a composition is supposed to be for a film, like just be the soundtrack for these moments. So like in your discussions with VT Nayani, who's the director and one of the co-writers, what were the discussions you had, not only at the beginning of the production, but maybe throughout the film, where you were like, we had this idea, but then as production went on, you decided, okay, this is actually where we want to take the score in this direction, because like this feels more natural for what is happening as we're going along.
Yeah, I mean, like, it was also about like these two young women in Toronto, like, well, what kind of music would they listen to, right? Like, what's the music in their lives? And initially, so there's a mix of like pop songs in there as well, but initially we were talking about, should we do a more pop kind of score? And we tried some things there, and then we moved away from that direction, and we went into a place of like, because it's shot in a certain beautiful kind of way, and there's a way both of the characters move too. And you see these ways that they walk around the city and they look around and stuff, and everything has this sort of very dreamlike quality. So it felt like the moment they start seeing each other, they've entered this magical space, this sort of feeling where color is popping, where like everything seems almost hyper real and hyper emotional. And to do it in a way that was, as you're saying, not overly sentimental. Like, the trick with music, I think the balance is, we don't want to be telling people what to feel ever. We're trying to create a unique sonic world of what does it feel like to be in there, right? And you're thinking about what it's like for first love and the butterflies in your stomach, and suddenly you're queasy because you're overwhelmed with sensation, but also you're taking in all these things. So it needed to have that quality of like, this is a world that's a world of their own, right? And it is romantic. It's romantic when it's romantic, and it's sad and upsetting in other places, but it's never the goal. What we want to make sure is that the music isn't telling or doing what's already in the film. It needs to crack the subtext and bring that out, right? So that was always a dance that we were sort of dancing around, and there were places where we had to really back off, and there were scenes where their voices and their conversation is the music. We don't need to add music to that. So restraint is a big part of it, and that's huge with dramas, I think, in my experience, because so much of it is in the writing, so much of it is in the film, and if you just put too much, you destroy what's already there.
Mhm.
So my job as a composer is to help elevate or bring out things in it, right? So it's always that dance of like, there's moments in the film that very lean itself to music, where it's like, this is all about feeling and color in that sense. And then there are other moments where the music doesn't need to quite be there. And that was the balance we were sort of finding.
Hmm. Right. And one of the responsibilities of a composer, is I think particularly for films like this, where you have, because as we were saying, we're talking about films, it's a film about people from different cultures, and different cultures when it comes to songs have
Mm-hmm.
different tones and different methods and different vocalizations, you know. But then there's something that's always so interesting to me about especially for people of color, and like sometimes like we're all from very different cultures, but when you hear like vocalizations, like, you know, like in some countries there's like ululating, and then like there's some
Yeah.
cultures where it's just like humming or moaning, you know. But then it's like you just hear these moments and you know exactly, you hear these songs and you know exactly the emotion that's trying to be conveyed, and you have
Yeah.
that in this film. So talk about like finding the singers and the artists that you use to like do those kind of like vocalizations, and then just like composing the structure of those, because sometimes I was wondering, how do you compose like vocalization, like relating on this and like moaning, and like even like
Yeah.
for like being Black, there's like Negro spirituals, and like there are those kind of songs where we just move from singing using lyrics to just like humming and following the flow. So you kind of have that in the film. So like talk about like structuring those and finding the artists you use.
Yeah, I mean, totally. Like, I come from a also South Asian Carnatic music training, like background as well. I've been in that world for so long. And yeah, like vocal inflections and the different ways that you think about rendering is so huge. Like it changes everything, right? So, I mean, when I write, I usually start with myself only, and I'm writing these themes and these sort of melodic and musical ideas, often at the piano, and I sort of sketch them out. I sort of create these recordings and mock-ups, and then I sort of invite other musicians into the process. So, I mean, this like string quartet stuff there, that's pretty straightforward. I sort of write everything and it gets recorded as in they read off sheet music. But with soloists, it's always interesting because you, like you said, is working on those nuanced inflections and things like that. And with this, it was, it's a low budget film, so right from the start, they were like, we don't have much money to like bring in musicians and stuff, and I'm saying it's okay, we're going to make this work. So I reached out to my network of friends and colleagues and musicians that I've worked with in so many different ways in the past, and it's just such a, we managed to get so much music recorded for this from all different kinds. And again, it was coming back to what are the colors we associate with different characters. But with the vocal work and stuff, yeah, like what I would do is I would write these melodies, and work with the singer and sort of, let's explore different ways to sort of, uh, like, how do we open this melody and how do we close it? Like, where do we bring the humming in? Because the moment the first love theme comes in, when they see each other, it's hummed, it's closed, it's muted, it's reserved, it's anticipation without acknowledgement. And then how do we open that, like, and what are all the different, and you see as there's more turbulence and turmoil in both of their lives, you see that, hear that in the vocal inflections as well. You're hearing different ways that we chose to vote, like play with different vowels and different ways of rendering sound, and that was just a really, really fun process. In the same way, with some of the string solo stuff, Drew Jureka and his quartet played the quartet stuff, and that's a more Western classical way of, these emotional violin solos. But then at the end, I asked my friend Olivia Komachit, who also played the mandolin and guitar, for the opening and everything. And, I gave her, this melody, and I asked her, can you play it on the fiddle in the fiddling style of the Comanche Nation and stuff? And, it's just such a different way of how she thinks about melody and how she thinks about performance, and the way they even enter a note and leave a note is so different from a classical Western tradition. And you can hear that like right in the performances, those two different ways of thinking about sound, but it's the same instrument, it's the violin.
Mhm.
It's just performed differently, and that was really beautiful, and that brought a certain rawness and a certain inflection in color that was so necessary for that moment as well. um, in the same way, like we sort of drew a little bit on jazz and sort of, in some of the brass writing. uh, I worked with Chanel Crico, and she has a brass quintet of phenomenal players, and She's a good friend of mine, also a composer, and we sort of spoke about, how do we find this tone that sort of draws from, like, something that's very regal and nostalgic, but at the same time has all this freedom of color. And just Michael Jones, who played the trumpet solos, is a fantastic musician. So it's been a real mix of like different colors and different traditions of music, and that kind of came in together. And I think what we've built with the score is this really colorful mosaic of just different sounds and different ways of hearing sound. It's been just a real treat getting to work with some of the best musicians and friends on this, and I'm glad we all made it work.
Yeah, like hearing you like just like name all of the different artists that you worked with, and then like the different cultures they're coming from, like for like Comanche, like I think that's one of the beauties about Canada and about being in Toronto, is that we meet so much people, so many different, what am I saying? So many people from so many different cultures and different like countries. Like you are able to, and then you see there's the commonalities, like how you can use a European instrument like the violin, and then you use it to like give, I guess you could say, give voice to your own culture, but with this European instrument, And I think that's something, and I talked about to VT and Priya about this in our interview, where I was saying like one of my favorite scenes in the film is like when they have their first date, and Malaya and Gwana-Hostai, their first conversation is their own, about their preconceptions about who they thought they were. Like, Malaya, she didn't think that Gwana-Hostai was First Nation. She didn't think she was Mohawk. She thought she was Iranian, whereas Gwana-Hostai, she thought that Malay was First Nations. And it has to do, and like they were saying, and I said in the interview, it has to do with how like we have, especially for a lot of people of color, because we watch so much Western TV, and like a lot of it's produced by white people, and in Hollywood in particular, where they have their own preconceptions and their own stereotypes and their own ideas of who people of color are, from particularly whether you're First Nations, whether you're Native American, whether you're from the Caribbean like I am, or from Southeast Asia or South Asia like you are. Like we only see specific, or we used to only see specific interpretations and representations of people from these cultures. So when you meet people, like suddenly you're like, oh, especially unless you're well read and well educated, and you grow up watching and learning of people from different cultures. And if you watch, like I used to watch like a lot of documentaries, and I watched a lot of like National Geographic and different films. So it was like I always kind of had the knowledge and the idea of like, okay, every person that looks Asian is not Chinese, that kind of thing. Whereas if you watch American TV, especially in the like before, I would say probably 2000, 2005, you only saw one idea of what a Native American looked like. Now it's changing. And that's what representation is about. Representation is only about getting to see us on screen, but getting to see the different variations of us on screen. Like being from the Caribbean, I want to see people from Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, Martinique. From Southeast Asia, you want to see people from Malaysia. I want to see people from Suriname. I want to see people from Tamil, Sri Lanka. I want to see people from the Philippines, right? And like all these people look different, even within their own cultures and within their own communities. Everyone looks different, and the film explores that. So like hearing you talk about the different people you meet, like this is one of the things about a multicultural society. And when you have films like this where it talks about what representation means and what identity means, you get to explore these things in like the music, and like give musicians from these different cultures opportunity to play like these representations of their cultures, and show like this is how you can like appreciate our music. And like a lot of white people say, oh, like, how would you go and play Native American instrument on like a European, on like the violin or the trombone or the trumpet? I'm like, this is how.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's the fact that we're complicated. We're not just one thing, right? Like, I don't think people who are not, who are of immigrant families or non-white folks and everything, like, identity is complicated. We're not just the color of our skin. We're not just our language. We're not just, the traditional instruments that we grew up with. We are so much more, we're so much more than that, right? And so the nuance of that and the tensions in that are interesting. Like, you talk about, like, I love how you're speaking about the kind of movies and stuff that talk about representation and stuff. And the fact is, like, I think a lot of people of color, like, grew up with those American movies because that was what was available to us at the time. And that is also a part of our culture because, we grew up, or at least I did, I grew up here for my life and everything. At the same time, there's all this family heritage and culture that I grew up with in home. And so the reality is identity is so mixed and pluralistic and complicated. And so what I love about this film is that it does explore those tensions, right? Like to be Sri Lankan Tamil in Toronto is not just one thing. There's something about even radical about the film where, it's about a brother and sister living alone in a place downtown Toronto. That's pretty such a cool way of seeing a Sri Lankan Tamil family. You wouldn't really expect that from, like the typical way that immigrants are depicted on film. In the same way we see like, Gonioshta dealing with her Iranian and her Mohawk heritage too. It's very contemporary. It's very now. And that's the fact that people can hold multiple truths. People can hold multiple stories and multiple lineages. And it was the same thing we were trying with the music too, and taking like we didn't want to make identity one thing and just one box. And that's why we were like, we want to avoid just putting instruments to people, like traditional instruments to people, and making it that kind of music, because that's not what they're about. They're not just about the place they come from, right? It's also the place they're in, and it's the people they're becoming. And like just think about all the different kinds of music that even you and I listen to because of the different backgrounds we've come from, right? Like how diverse and pluralistic that must be compared to like the average person and everything. And like taking like even for even like Gonioshta and like her character, like I wrote these like oboe solos that feel like almost semi-improvisatory, and there's almost sort of like a very different tradition of playing that oboe in there that I was really interested in. So it's like taking these Western instruments and finding the same tension, like what else can they do? What else can they be bent to do? Because that's what we're dealing with as people, right? Like to grow up in school here, being South Asian was always negotiating that. Like there's these two things, and code switching and all these things about like what it's like to be a person growing up here is huge, and it's a part of us. Like, and that's that tension and those contradictions and that friction is what makes us so interesting, and it's what drives our art, and it's the reason we end up where we are. And I think the film captures that so beautifully, and I was just trying to do that with the music as well.
Yeah, we're adaptable and we have to be, right? Because you talk about the code switching. That's another thing in the film where like you're hearing multiple languages being spoken in one conversation. You hear someone, you hear them switch from the Mohawk language to English. And then you have like switching from Tamil to English, and then even in the background, in like when you go into like the stores, you hear the Iranian music playing, but then like the grocery, the owner, she switches from speaking Iranian to English, and it shows like we are very multifaceted. Like for me, I switched from my Barbadian dialect and accent to kind of like a nondescript accent, kind of like so people can understand me. Because if I speak in my accent, most people wouldn't understand me. But that's just like I think that's one of the things I love talking with like filmmakers and creatives like you, especially people of color from different countries and different communities and cultures, because we I think have a special gift and ability, and like being creatives and like working in film shows that where people will say, oh, and it just occurred to me, but it's kind of funny how people will, especially I'm going to just be blunt, so white people will look at people like us from different cultures and say we're primitive, or they have this idea and think that we're uneducated or that we can only do this one thing. And I'd be like, can you switch from one dialect to the next within the space of 2 words? Can you? Like you can't, right? Can you are you able to experience the different foods that we eat, listen to the different musics that we hear, and be able to appreciate the differences and the nuances and the similarities that we have in the music? Like I said, like we were talking about the singing and the vocalization, that I'm from a completely different culture to Mohawk and Tamil, but I can still appreciate the vocalizations because it's still very, very familiar to me, to how my people sing and how my people appreciate music.
Yeah, there's something about having that where you can appreciate things even outside of your culture in a way that I feel like if you didn't grow up with that, we're violently aware of our differences, right? Because we have to be. Like we know that when we're in certain spaces, if we don't even carry ourselves a certain way, it could be dangerous. Like we've grown up with that fear, I think, and on different levels based from different communities, right? Like, I'm not saying we're all the same
Yeah.
either, but because we've had to be very aware of our differences, we're also very aware of what we share in a way that, if we're speaking bluntly, white folks won't be, because you've never had to really think about that in that space, right? It's a certain privilege that comes with that. But like, I share that kinship where when I hear other traditions of music too, I'm like, oh my gosh, we share a similar way of thinking about improvisation, or we share a similar way of thinking about uh, even things like mourning and grief. And like, it's so like, because our communities, we're just very intelligent about the way we listen to things and the way we see things. And it's also part of like coming from an immigrant community, or like, I'm the son of refugees and stuff, and like the first thing that people look for when families come here is sort of community and kinship. And there's this idea of giving out hands and reaching out to folks and taking them, like that's something that we grew up with, and so we've always just naturally intuitively looked for that. And there's so many things, like the way we speak multiple languages, we've been in different spaces, so it just demands our attention in a certain way that you won't have if you didn't grow up with that. And that's what makes our identity so complicated, and that's why we can lean on each other culturally in so many interesting ways. It's crazy. Like, and I think it's something we take for granted because we grew up for that. But I know I have friends who are, white, if we're speaking bluntly, and it's conversations we've had with very good friends of mine, just like, that's something that they can't listen for because it's just something they didn't grow up with. And it's kind of crazy that way, isn't it?
It is, because like you, like at the beginning you talked about how your trajectory, you grew up learning all of these multiple instruments, and then like your parents were like, you're going to become a doctor, and you kind of went into that, but now you're doing but the thing is, I'm just going to say a more creative field, but I think being a good doctor involves creativity, because you like being able to diagnose and listen to patients, it involves a certain aspect of creativity as well. But it's just like being a musician, I think in particular, like I think having the background that you have does help you be a better musician and a composer, because like you have to be able to, when you're thinking of a scene and you have, like, they show you a scene, you have to be able to interpret the scene with music, and you have to be able to say, as you said, like you were saying, okay, I don't want to use this instrument, this is the instrument I associate with the scene, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the culture of the characters, because you don't want to make it over sentimental, or you don't want to stereotype the scene in a way, or you don't want to stereotype the characters, because I think that's a mistake that a lot of white composers do. And like they're like, okay, if we're in Iran, all the instruments must be Iranian, or all the music must sound Iranian, or their idea of what Iranian music sounds like. And we're like, but like Iranian people listen to Western pop too. You could go and go throw some Rihanna or some Lady Gaga in the background. Like you go into a store, like everything isn't gonna be traditional music. They're gonna be listening to Michael Jackson in the store too. Right?
And Iranian pop is also really cool. Like, and like, it's the same thing with it's the same thing with the Middle East in general too, right? Like anytime you see a desert in a movie and suddenly there's a duduk in the background, or there's some wailing happening, and you're like, it's not even the music people there listen to. It's a very white lens of thinking about diversity in music. And it's funny, you like you say, you only see that most often in scores written by white men. So you're like, it's a very particular way of seeing cultures, and we weren't interested in that. We're like, we're not here to put people in a box, and it's not even about that. We're people listen to all sorts of kinds of things, and like and our music, our cultural music is changing and has been changing for a very long time now. So to suddenly tie and root in like Tamilness or Iranian identity or Mohawkness to just one way of making music from a certain time is, just wrong. Like it'd be like saying that anytime there's a white person, we should be playing Mozart. Like it doesn't clock. You know what I mean?
Right. Like, oh, if you have this movie, you must go play some Claire de Lune. I'm like, really?
Yeah, that's right.
It's true. Yeah. But I do appreciate some good Mozart, and I do appreciate a good
I love Mozart. I love Bach. But... you can't, that stuff can't be, we can't break that down. That's the stuff that's still driving music now. Like
It's
Uh,
true. It's
it's
true. Every
crazy.
year I play Handel's Messiah, so
Love it. Love it. I mean, it's crazy. Like you think about music is very cyclical that way, right? Like all that stuff never actually goes away. Bach is still, his rules are still what drives modern pop music.
Mm,
So that stuff is it's built in like and that's what music is, right? Like I think of music and art in general as it's always cumulative research. We're always building on people work that we've inherited and then we're just building on top of that and then people are
mm,
taking that after us too, and I think film does the same thing. Film is just younger, uh,
mm.
but we're constantly drawing from everything before us. And I think if you go into this thinking you're going to reinvent the wheel, you're doing it wrong. um, where this is actually a very collective art. We're actually doing this in relation to each other,
Mm,
and that's what kind of makes it beautiful.
mm.
So yeah, Bach and stuff, Mozart's great. They're not going away anytime soon. They're still here. So
Yeah. I know we're gonna wrap it up because I know you still have to go. But one of the things that has always interested me in music, and we can use this to kind of tie into what you were talking about, is it's so interesting to me that with music we have a limited amount of notes. You know, the scale is
True.
only this big, and you only have the A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And
Yeah.
I was just trying to remember this. I'm like, yes, I'm right. And but you have a finite amount of notes, but it's just like amazing to me how we're able to build uh infinite amount of sounds from these
Yeah.
very one specific set of notes. So for you as a composer and someone who the background you have and just like your appreciation for music and your appreciation for different cultures and different sounds, what would be your goal as a composer going forward, having worked on this place and the experiences that you've had? Like, is there something you're saying, I may have this amount of notes, but this is my goal as a composer?
Yeah, I mean that's a big one, isn't it? For me, I think it's about sort of finding and landing on a voice that's authentic to myself. Like,
Mhm.
I don't think I'm, I don't think I'm again coming with the goal that I need to reinvent or break the wheel or anything like that. I think my goal is to find a way, and this is what I've been working on, is of all these diverse experiences that I've been in, coming together in a voice that is feels and sounds truly like myself. I think I've just grown up writing so many different kinds of music, from so many different kinds of genres, and even in different ways of producing sound. And I'm constantly learning. I'm still learning, and I will be for such a forever. So it's for me like I soak up all these experiences, and my goal is how can it come together in a way that sounds like Kalaisan, that sounds like me, and that sounds honest and done with integrity. And I'm hoping that with everything I do, I'm inching closer towards that. Whether it's in film, TV, or concert music or whatever. Like, it's so tempting in especially a film world because you're constantly being asked to sound like something or someone else. Uh, I'd like to be asked to sound like me. So that's the goal, right? And you're seeing it a lot in like exciting composers now. Like you hear Nicholas Britell, who did like Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk, and like he done that now where he has a sound and everyone wants sort of the Britell sound. Or like Emil Mosseri, who did like Last Black Man in San Francisco, or
Mm.
Minari, or Johnny Greenwood, from Radiohead, who's one of my all-time favorites.
You're
Uh,
such a surprise as a composer. I'm like, look at what, like,
and he's
that's like
phenomenal.
Radiohead. I'm like, come on now, that's a progression.
And then it makes you think about all the stuff he was doing in Radiohead, and you're like, and I
Yeah.
love Radiohead. And you're like, oh yeah, okay, it makes sense. You were always kind of just weird and cool and doing strange things, and now he writes for like orchestras and this and that, and I'm like, yes, Johnny, or Johan Johansson. Like these are all people who
Yeah.
have lived very long lives and experienced so much. So then their music at this point, I mean, Johansson has passed unfortunately, but like everyone else has sort of like found something that's so true to them and their experience. And that, like, for me to achieve that would be, I'd be very happy about it. But that's what I'm working towards, and hopefully it's getting closer there with everything I do.
Yeah. I said last question, but you mentioned Radiohead, so I have to ask, have you seen Arcane? It's a animated show on Netflix, but it's based on a game called Arcane. And the reason I
Oh
asked,
no.
you mentioned Radiohead, but this one of some of the songs and the main theme is that performed by Imagine Dragons. And I'm like,
Right.
Imagine Dragons, but in like classical form. I'm like mind blown. So I was gonna ask video games or animated projects.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to do animated stuff. I've, so many great things that I love about animation. I would love to try things with that. Video games too seems really interesting to me. It's not something I'm pursuing at this moment, but it's just such a different way of writing music because it's like driven by triggers and loops and
Yeah.
like there's an AI engine and it's very I have some friends who write video game music and it's a whole other beast. I'd love to tap into it at some point, but there's just so many things you can try, and life is too short. But yeah, I mean, I love that, and we can talk about Radiohead forever. That could be a
It's
whole.
true. I could talk about 90s all music. Give me some Smashing Pumpkins or Red Chili Peppers or like,
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. Hell yes.
The Cranberry is one of my favorite groups ever. But no, I must stop.
We'll
But
we'll we'll exchange that. We'll start exchanging some lists. We'll make it happen. We can do
yeah,
that for the next podcast.
for sure. You know what? I can invite you for another podcast after I do all of this tip stuff. Thank
Love
you
it.
so much for talking with me, Kalaisan. This was a joy. This is amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Just
Yay.
really fun to get to chat with
Thank
you about
you.
this.